seeing them come together, that Shabbos could unite us, that Judaism could unite us, to see what we have in common, not what divides us. You know, when we read in the parsha last week about the Tower of Babel, and you saw how unity could be misused. They all gathered in order to build a tower to go to the heavens and challenge God, etc. That's like the unity of the United Nations, where you see how it can be misused because there's only one thing they agree on there, and that's to beat up on Israel. And then you also saw the symbol of the rainbow with its array of colors, that was what God chose to represent the era and the promise that he made, the pledge it would never happen again. But why wasn't the rainbow made of one color? Why did it have to be multiple colors? And the answer is because that was the message, just that we're always going to be a wide array of people. We're going to have different views, we have different persuasions. But we have to remember that when we come together, and all the colors, all the hues, join together, we make such a beautiful symbol. It's then when we can accomplish things. The difference between Abraham and Noah that we read this week was that Noah was a great man, but it was in his generation. And why? Because he didn't reach out. He built his ark. It was a symbol for others to get a message, but he didn't reach out to warn them, to engage them. Abraham reached out. The message to Abraham was to leave your house, your home, to break the bonds, to reach out then, to establish himself anew so that he would meet the challenge, but he would be open to others and be able to enlist them and identify those who could be part with him. And God kept testing him, not because he didn't know the outcome, but because he wanted him to show how he would respond so that others would see and others would learn from him. And that is the difference we see, that Abraham wasn't told where he was going. El Arta Shehareka, to the land that I will show you. God doesn't tell him that, because first he has to know where he's coming from. Before he can tell him where he has to go, Abraham has to know where he was coming from. And that's why he has to leave the things that most form a person's character, his home, his city, his community. And then to be able to go out in the world and accomplish what God had in mind for him. And mostly to the land that he would show him. And we're still doing that. We still have to be reminded of where we're coming from, which is why this is so important. To remind us of our roots, to take us back to the basic facts, which so often get lost, especially amongst young people who have no time, no patience for facts. They want everything now. They want instant solutions. It's easy to criticize. It's easy to jump on the bandwagon. It's very difficult, I understand, for many of them on campuses to stand up because they don't know. They don't feel equipped. They don't feel confident to stand up and argue and make the case. It's true of many adults, too. I see it on the radio, how many non-Jews write me after the shows. It can be, you know, there are 30,000 podcasts downloaded every Thursday night of that show. 30,000 podcasts. But they're in the Midwest, they're in the West, they're all over America, in fact, all over the world. And I look, where's the Jewish community? Where are we in taking the case we have? Because we have a great case. We just have to have the confidence. So God is reminding us, he's giving us all the blessings we could imagine. He's given us back the land of Israel. He gave us Jerusalem. He gives us the power in the United States to have influence, to make a difference. He gives us so many allies. We just have to be willing to see the signs. He's testing us. And I believe, very honestly, and many of you have heard me speak dozens of times here and in many places, and I know you don't always like my message because I always try to tell you the truth, and sometimes the truth is painful. But I will tell you that I don't believe there was any time in decades, maybe even in the last 7 decades, when it was more important for us to come together, to recognize the challenges, to see the opportunities, but to understand how important this moment is. Because the decisions that are being made now are not decisions for years or even decades, they will be for generations. Our grandchildren and their grandchildren will pay the price for what we do or fail to do. That includes what we do regarding Iran in the next 2 weeks, and what we do regarding the other challenges that I'm going to discuss very briefly, and I know you have other speakers who will talk about the strategies. The only thing that's predictable today is that nothing's predictable. All the things we were promised for the 21st century look much more like the 19th century. the breakdown of all the boundaries. Can anybody tell me what the borders of Syria are, where they are today? Anybody know where the borders of Iraq are today? And I will tell you, nobody knows the borders of Lebanon anymore. You don't know it yet, but believe me, it's disappearing. And you have al-Nusra, and you have al-Qaeda, and you have the IS, all having established beachheads in Lebanon, and challenging Hezbollah, which is, of course, involved in Syria and been very stretched. So Lebanon is history, Lebanon's future is very much in doubt. In Tripoli, look at the fighting goes on every day. The New York Times doesn't bother to cover it. But you have very serious civil war going on. And it's spreading across the country, so there is virtually no country untouched in the Middle East. What we see is them going back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and erasing all the borders that were drawn by the colonialists, who established countries that were not real. Syria is not a real country. Libya is not a real country. It's 147 tribes that they cobbled together, and only a dictator could keep them together. Syria are Druze and Huranis and Sunnis and Shiites and Christians and Kurds, but they're not Syrians. Egypt is a real country. And Egypt held together, and Egypt's army could, because people have an Egyptian identity, and that they were able to use that identity to overcome some of the temporary challenges. Even now, though, you see how the Muslim Brotherhood is still fighting, and you see all of the other internal divisions that continue in Egypt. I met President Sisi just 2 weeks ago, and I will tell you in a minute what he said. But he is a real leader. He's a strong, with very clear vision and understanding of what the challenges really are. And you need somebody like that in a country like Egypt, because its economy is in ruins. 50% of the people make $2 a day. That's the reason why you had the eruption there. It wasn't an Arab Spring. It's an Arab volcano that's continuing to erupt in so many places and will continue for the next decade or 2 decades to erupt. This is not a temporary phenomenon. We're going to see the aftershocks going on for a long time. I was in Egypt 4 times since the revolution. And believe me, I was in Tahrir Square, where you saw signs against the United States, but not one against Israel. And you see the new level of cooperation between Egypt and Israel. Sisi said to me, if I had told you 30 years ago that 1,000 Egyptian tanks would go into the Sinai, and Egyptian aircraft would fly along the border of Israel, and nobody has to worry about a stray bullet. And that is the cooperation between them, the United States and between Israel and Egypt, that has enabled us to begin to confront some of the dangers, especially in the Sinai, which under Morsi and even under Mubarak had become a haven, no less than Somalia, worse than Somalia, where you had thousands of terrorists from 16 different groups operating freely, establishing a base with heavy weapons that came from Libya and the Sudan, with Iranian influence, and guided by the terrorists in Gaza. And now, for the first time, there's a serious effort to confront it and diminish it. As you saw, the attack that took 31 Egyptians' lives, and now they've gone in, they're building a barrier. Where did we hear that before? Along the border with Gaza. Demolished many homes in order to do it, but the world doesn't care. And now they're building a moat in that 500 feet that from the border that they've cleared this zone. They're putting in a moat so that they can't build more tunnels. Egypt closed more than 1,000 tunnels in the last year. 1,000 tunnels. There are still 500 operating. So you see how vast this operation and infrastructure was. The fact that you still have weapons pouring out of Libya after all of this time, just think, and going to many countries, to Mali, to the Sudan, to Lebanon, to Syria. Just think of what he had there, that it continues to pour out. So the Arab Spring had nothing to do with democracy. There were people who wanted democracy, but that's not what it was about. It was about jobs and economy and people wanting to have a better life for their kids. Second, it was about the information revolution, that people had the ability to communicate by computer that they didn't have before when there were all the restrictions placed on them by governments. Third, as I said, it's about failed states. countries that did not have a real binding identity. And fourth, it's about the Sunni-Shiite war of 1,000-year stand. And if you don't see that, you won't understand anything of what's happening. That's the core. This is a battle for hegemony in the Middle East. It's a battle between those trying to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, the crazy man Erdogan and his friends, those who want to reestablish the Persian Empire, the crazy Hoenlein and his friends, those who want to establish a Wahhabi empire out of Saudi Arabia, and those who want to establish a Muslim Brotherhood empire, which initially succeeded, but thank God has had real setbacks, both in Egypt and the remarkable election in Tunisia, where we did nothing to help them. When these people overthrew the Ennahda Party, which was a parallel to the Iranian Revolution, came the same time, 1979, same goals, same direction, and the people stood up against it, and now in an election this past week, they defeated the Ennahda Party, but not by much. They got 80 seats, the secularists, the Ennahda got 70 out of 217 seats. But it's a message from the people. And what has the West done for Tunisia? Nothing, except make more demands and press them and push them in the wrong direction. To me, the most important symbol of the indifference of the West and lack of understanding of how serious this moment is Yemen. Now, those of you who listen to John Boucher's show know, but for the last 3 months I kept warning, Yemen's going to fall. Yemen's going to fall. We got to get into it. We have to help now. Nobody cares. I called the American administration. I spoke to European leaders. I told them that it's a matter of months. Then it was a matter of weeks. And those weeks were going to be so upset, I told them a matter of days. And what street they were coming in. Moves, and they are outside the capital. It could have been stopped with a few drones. They hung and beheaded 15 policemen, hung their heads on the poles as a declaration that they were going to enter the capital, and nobody did anything. You remember we had the USS Cole there. Remember we have a military presence. We have the capacity to do it. And this ragtag army marched into Sana'a, and this past week took over Hodeida, which is just above the Bab el-Mandab. You know what it is? It's the second most important straits in the world. And now Iran, through their agents, control that. There's Somalia on one side, Yemen on the other. 60% of the world's oil comes through it. 40% of the West's oil. All the shipping from the Gulf of Aden, from the Suez Canal, from the Red Sea, has to go through those points. And you can close them with a few mortar shells. And Iran also controls the other end with the Straits of Hormuz. This is a radical change in the whole geopolitical structure of the Middle East, and nobody cares. Nobody lifted a finger. When you say to people, where's Yemen on the map? Nobody knows. They think it's New Jersey. They have no idea where it is. They thought Christie was the head of Yemen. He does too, but that's a country like that, so geopolitically significant, falls. This is the war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And now they've made this incredible leap. Now where do you think Saudi Arabia feels itself at this point? I was in Saudi Arabia. I won't give you the details, but I was there. And you have to listen to how the Arab leaders talk about what's happening. How they talk about Israel as our only hope. We'll condemn them, but we pray for them. That's the exact words they use. We condemn them, but we pray for them. But they're the only hope against the enemy. The enemy is Iran. It's the overriding enemy of every country in the region. even of the Iranian people. So the Arab volcano is going to keep. Then it changed because they split with Al-Qaeda to ISIL, Islamic State in Iraq. It was ISIL. Then it became ISIS. When they started fighting in Syria, it became the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Then it became ISIL, which was Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Not Lebanon, as people say. The Levant, because that includes Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Iraq, and Syria. And it tells you the goal. Now, they're IS, because there's no limit. The Islamic State in the Middle East. When they talk about the caliphate, when the guy has, their leader has... We chose not to, because we don't want to face reality. It's the world today is ignorant and indifferent. And that's exactly the most burning ground. You know that 1,000 foreign fighters join every single month. There are today more than 20,000 fighters from 80 countries, and I will tell you it's closer to 30,000. And their whole army is today closer to 40,000, including hundreds from the United States, hundreds from Canada. The Royal Mounted Police have just uncovered, said that 80 of them have already come back. They uncovered 86 plots involving 92 people. Half of Great Britain's MI5 is devoted just to dealing with the threat posed by returning fighters from Syria. It's all right. Is it vodka or water? The foreign fighters represent a whole new category of threat for us as Jews, because we're the main target. You saw in Peru this week, they uncovered Hezbollah plot against the Israeli embassy, against Jewish institutions, etc. But I can tell you, I could read you the list of all the ones that I uncovered just in the last 2 weeks of potential plots in different parts of the world. And while we may be the first victim, we're never the last. And the world thinks this is our battle. They're making a fundamental error, because the major enemy is the United States, not Israel. That's the great Satan. We only made the little Satan. You have to work harder, but we'll... ISIL is a real threat. They mean what they say what they mean, and you see how they use any means. Now, all of you, I'm sure, felt the revulsion at the beheadings, right? Everybody said, how could this be? Look at this. They leave the heads along the roads. They go into Iran. It's the best recruiting tool they ever had. And today, every one of the groups, Hezbollah beheads people. In the Sinai, they behead people. In Yemen, they beheaded people. Everybody's doing it, because they found out that that's how young people respond. That rather than the sense of revulsion that we would all feel about this barbaric behavior, it turns out that this excites them, and that these guys passing the test of being the real guys. They make $10 million a month just from the sale of oil. You know who they're selling the oil to? Assad, whom they're trying to overthrow, to the Kurds, whom they're trying to destroy, and to Turkey, who will do anything for business. This caliphate is a serious threat. And they're making that progress. You know that they have a place, they took over the city of Raqqa, which is where the oil is in Syria. And the first thing they did is to establish training camps there for attacks in foreign countries. And many of the recruits are now told not to leave their country, but they train them over the internet to carry out attacks abroad. But hundreds, if not thousands, have been trained in Raqqa. And Al-Qaeda, not to be outdone when they saw how big this effort was, established a group called the Khorasan, whose sole purpose is to take the attacks abroad. So those who think Al-Qaeda has disappeared, those who think that we don't have these problems, ask the Christians of the Middle East today. What a disgrace that the world says nothing when Christians from Malaysia and Indonesia to Egypt to Nigeria to Iran, Iraq, Syria die in the thousands every year. Where's the outcry? Where are all those groups, the Human Rights Council, the Vatican, everybody else, the World Council of Churches, so quick to condemn Israel for defending its citizens and protecting the Christians in its borders? The only place in the Middle East where the Christian population has increased, only one place, that's the Jewish state. And where when you ask Christians in the region, where do they want to go, they all say to Israel. Where is the outcry? How is it that we have learned nothing in 70 years, that the words never again to us mobilize us and teach us that we have to speak out? We had this week guests from the Yazidi community in Iraq. It breaks your heart to listen to it. People were crying as they spoke. And then they said, we begged the Americans, bomb the roads. Just bomb the roads. We have 5,000 women who have been kidnapped, raped, tortured, sold into slavery. Just bomb the roads. And everybody in that room thought the same thing. The world that was silent when we asked them to bomb the railroads and the entrances to Auschwitz, etc. The world learns very little. We also had as a guest a refugee from Syria, a man who grew up hating Israel, until one day in a refugee camp he encountered people who were bringing blankets and food and stuff when they were hungry and starving. Finally he discovered that they were Israelis, and he turned it all back and he said, we don't want it, what are you trying to do? You want to take over the country? To go. And he described his progress and how many people, hundreds that he brought to the field hospital in the Golan, how many hundreds were treated in Israeli hospitals. Do you read that story in the New York Times? How Israel's reaching out, and probably the only country working in Jordan and Iraq and Turkey, secretly, at the risk of their lives, young Israelis go in and bring aid and food and assistance. A story that doesn't get told. Do you know that Hania's own daughter this last week was treated in an Israeli hospital? His wife was treated during the war in an Israeli hospital. He sent his mother-in-law to the hospital in, I don't know what he intended with that, but to be treated in Israel. You read about that? That during the war, thousands of people from Gaza came to Israel to be treated, and that Israel built a field hospital along the border, and it was shelled all the time. These are not the stories. The good news doesn't get told. The role of Israel as a stabilizing force. Every Arab leader knows it. Every Arab leader says it today. They're not the destabilizing force, they're the stabilizing force. And if there's any hope, it's only going to be from Israel. What makes Israel the enemy is not because it does something wrong. I'm not saying it's perfect. It's not Disney World. Sometimes it's Never World, but it's not Disney World. But it faces real problems, real challenges. Sworn intention to destroy it. And when it defends itself, it defends itself already 8,000 rockets for one reason, not enough Israelis died. They all say disproportionality. Disproportionality is a legal term. It has nothing to do with it. It means how much force do you use in any set situation to defeat an enemy. Look how Israel pinpointed, and the new UN reports, everything shows how they hit isolated targets, and how the review process was the most complicated in the world. We had to have people sign off, including a lawyer, on every single strike. And how many times they passed leader because they saw a civilian that might have gotten hit by shrapnel.
So you can defend Israel with confidence today. Look at the world and look at how indifferent everybody is to the threats that exist today. Israel can't afford that luxury. And no matter how much criticism it gets, it has every right to have people live in Jerusalem, its eternal capital, and the capital of the Jewish people forever. I hope all this sniping will stop. I hope all these differences, the comments that were made, are unacceptable. America and Israel have too much in common. Every one of the issues I mentioned depend on Israel and the United States standing together. Israel, America doesn't have a better ally. It prepositions $1 billion in equipment in the Sinai because it knows it's the only place in the Negev, because they know it's the only place that they'll know it's there when they need it, and that Israel can withdraw and draw down. By the way, Israel's not building new settlements. There are no new settlements, and everything that you've heard about are all planning decisions, zoning decisions. It's a waste. I don't know why they announce it, why they let anybody announce it, because we keep paying a price for the same houses for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and they're still not built. And you know, by the way, this latest development was for Arabs as well as Jews. Nobody complains about all the Arabs who buy houses in Jerusalem now and are moving into Jewish areas of Jerusalem. That's permissible, but because Jews want to live in other areas, integrated areas. Again, sometimes they don't use the smartest PR, and we see all these statements, but usually it's some low-level guy who makes an announcement, and we're still talking over and over again about the same housing units. We hope that we can return to the negotiating table at some point. But look at the role that Abbas has played in inciting hatred, calling for a day of rage on Friday, at a time when things were so exciting, when you had the assassination attempt against a Jew because he advocated praying on the Temple Mount for Jews as well as Arabs, and was by all measures a gentle person, never involved in any terrorist or violent activities. And yet the NPR described him as a Jewish extremist. ISIS they call militants. Hamas is militants. Hezbollah is militants. But a Jew who defends the right of Jews on the Temple Mount, he's an extremist. Something wrong with that equation. We see the UN today still being the forum for anti-Israel activities, that now Venezuela got elected. The Security Council is a great tribute to that body. They'll find out what it's like living with them. We see the Human Rights Council passing scores of resolutions dealing with Israel, but nothing when 200,000 people have been killed in Syria, nothing about Lebanon, nothing about Iraq, nothing about Iran's massive violation of human rights, 852 executions in the past year. Where's the outcry? They hung priests from the top of cranes. They hang gays. They hang anybody who doesn't agree with their particular philosophy, even Muslims who disagree with them. 852 known executions, I should say. Believe me, it's many more than that. And yet the world says we have to talk to them, we have to cajole them into these negotiations. This is the most important issue, and I have many more I won't get to today, because I know my time is limited. But no meeting can take place that doesn't talk now about what we do between now and November 24th, that every elected official, our White House has to know where we stand, how we feel. That there can't be any deal that's not a good deal. No deal is better than a bad deal. That Iran, which keeps holding back and forcing the West to make more concessions and more concessions, weakening the sanctions regime at a time when the oil has collapsed, meaning that their economic condition is worse than ever. We have greater leverage than ever. The people of Iran want us to exercise it. They want this government to be gone. And we keep meeting in secret and saying to them, you can have more centrifuges. First we started no centrifuges, then a few hundred. Now we're talking about thousands. We're talking about the key issue being breakout time. Breakout time is only the time from when we discover they're making a bomb to the time they have it. So Iran is a critical issue for all of us. We have to work to strengthen the relationship with our elected officials, our members of Congress at every level, senators, also the local officials. At a time when anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head, when we see the attempts to ban Brit Milah and Shkita in Europe again, when we see the number of incidents every single day, but I can tell you that there isn't a day when we don't get a report from a campus in America of an anti-Semitic attack. Not a single day. Swastikas at Emory, at Yale, at Harvard, every state, universities across the country. And our job is to stand with the students today. Every community has to reach out. You have Rutgers, you have others. We have to stand with them, let them know we'll support them. We have the Lawfare Project. We provide lawyers. Believe me, we have 400 lawyers, most of them non-Jews, volunteering, because they get it. They get that this is a battle for the future of America, the future of Jews, our security. We had a SCAN conference at Rutgers. We had the leaders from all the European communities coming together with FBI, DHS, because the problems are universal. What they're experiencing, we are experiencing. It's not as severe as it in Europe, but we have to prevent it from becoming so. So this is a time when all of us have to step up for Israel. When we have to unite and stand together to show that we are Am Echad B'Lev Echad, we are one people of one heart. And that each of you becomes an ambassador of truth. That's all we're asking. Tell the truth. Unvarnished. Believe me, it's our strongest weapon. And Israel can be measured with all its flaws and shortcomings against any country in the world. And we should feel confident when we stand up to defend it. Because it's we who raise the bar on what we will tolerate. We have to say zero tolerance for anti-Israel activity, zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. We're not going to let our children be subjected to these kind of dangers. That we're going to protect the future, that we learned the lesson that never again means us preventing our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren from having to face the same challenges of previous generations. And it depends on us. It depends on you. And what you learn today can't stop here. It has to go out. You have to permeate the community. When Abraham was told, go out and count the stars, obviously they knew it wasn't possible. But God wanted to know that that's how the challenges of the Jews will be. It's a Don Quixote situation. You know, we tilt at windmills all the time. But when we go out and follow the lesson of Abraham and Sarah and all of our forefathers and foremothers, who came across incredible challenges and were tested all the time, as we are being tested now. If you follow their example, that they didn't give in, that they stood with pride, that they defended the case, and they made the case to others, then I think our future will be secure, and your children and grandchildren will look back and thank you for making it a safer world for them.